provides a cultural opportunity for students as well as the community to explore the rich heritage of St. Bernard and the New Orleans area. And now, to get on to the evening's entertainment, I'd like to introduce Dr. Thomas Warner, the Chancellor of Nunez Community College, who introduces speakers.
I need to thank, I guess, the author of this, the one who dreamed this up, who had the vision years ago, was Curtis Manning. Dr. Manning has done a tremendous job, and him and Pancho, whomever next to him here, Ron Chapman, have done a tremendous job in putting on this history lecture series. We want to continue it. Hope it's been good for you, and it's been great for us. And we're going to finish up tonight with the history of plantations in St. Bernard. And we have two great historians with us, Ron Chapman and Bill Hyland, and we certainly appreciate them. Without further ado, the history of plantations in St. Bernard Parish. Thank you.
Greetings. Can you all hear me okay? I can't see you with the lights. All right, I'll be opening the lecture with a very brief overview of plantations as factories, and then from that we'll go to Mr. William DeMarini Hyland, who will do a more in-depth presentation of the plantations in St. Bernard Parish. This is about the plantations in St. Bernard Parish. And the thing you have to remember about plantations is that they were factories, and you can never lose sight of that. The early plantations were organized along what was called the long lot system, which was a French system. And by that it was meant that along the river, so much land was allocated, so many arpits, which were 192 feet. And then you had the depth would go from either 40 arpit or 80 arpit, generally 40. That's why there'd be a 40 arpit canal across the back, because the canal was meant for drainage. You'd have drainage canals that would go up to the plantation as well. So as the canals drained the land, you could have more land for cultivation. In St. Bernard, they were generally dedicated to sugar production, although assortment of other work was done because obviously the cultivation season wasn't that long, so you'd have cases like the Roy plantation that were involved in brick manufacturing. Sometimes it would be rice milling, sometimes it would be sawmills. There'd be a variety of different production that was taking place while the plantation was in operation. The plantation was a closed system. Similar to a modern factory's production, in that you had the master and the family in the home. You'd have overseers, and then you would obviously have your slaves who were operating the plantation. You also had a large number, which is surprising if you read Mary Gaiman's book on free people of color. A lot of free people of color acted as overseers on the plantations. Slaves, as I said, were the primary workforce, and down here it was sugar. What a lot of people don't realize, if you look at the census of 1810, the African Americans accounted for 78% of the total population in St. Bernard Parish. You know, the dynamics changed as industry moved into the parish, oil industry first, and then Kaiser and sugar and things like that, and people started moving out of the city of New Orleans and moving into these areas further up where the plantations were. If you look, this is a 1793 French map which shows the arrangement of the plantations and how they looked. And let's see if I can work this little arrow here, if it's going to play with me. There it is. You can see the way the long lot system worked. You'd get so much territory across the front. These would be your boundary lines, and in the back it would disappear into the cypress swamp. Bill Hyland will go into much greater detail on this arrangement. This is a closer view, and if you look at this, you can certainly see here with the cypress swamps in the back. This is the area of cultivation in the front here. Here you can see the names of this is B Avenue Plantation, and if you get into here, you can see the river road, and these are the homes. And each one of these blocks is a distribution of where the homes were. If you notice down here, if I can get it to work with me, that's a brickyard, because bricks were being manufactured. This is a close-up view of the B Avenue Plantation. You can see here is the river road and the river. Here is the main home with some groves in front. This would more than likely be the slave homes. In the back, this would be the kiln and the brickyard. So if you look at a plantation layout, the way it would work is the first thing you would have would be obviously, your river, and this would be the land. Behind it would be the cypress swamp. In the off-season, slaves would be sent into the swamp to hunt, to fish, or to cut down the trees, because they used the trees for wood, for heating, or actually for the wood that they would shape and cut to manufacture whatever buildings had to be done on the plantation. Each plantation owner was required to maintain the levee in front of his plantation along his property line. He was also required to maintain the road in front of him. So as the plantations worked their way downriver, sequentially you had the development of the levees and the road system. So if you look at St. Bernard Parish today, you see the industries of what was the Kaiser facility, now the port, the sugar industry, and the two oil refineries and the tank farms that are associated with them. But in actuality, you originally had a situation much like upriver, where you had a simple levee, a river road, and the plantations behind it. The main house would be part of it. In front of the house later, when you get to around the 1820s, 1830s, you would have a grove of trees as an entranceway, like the Pakenham Oaks. On the sides, you'd have gardens, sometimes orchards, where you could be growing citrus fruit or peaches or whatever, sort of food. A cistern, I don't know how many of you all remember a cistern, but that was the source of fresh water. It always alarms my students when they think that their source of fresh water came from the gutter pipes on the roof. But it was better than taking it straight out the river, downriver from l'abattoir. The kitchen was separate for the simple reason is that if you had a kitchen fire, you didn't want to burn the plantation down. That was forgotten, and if you remember just a few years ago, the great plantation Tuscuco was burned down to the ground. Why? Because there was a kitchen fire, and the kitchen fire had been moved indoors. Often also associated with that, they would call, which would be the whistling walk, which was a walkway from the kitchen to the home. And they called it the whistling walk because the slaves were required, as they brought the food into the home, to whistle to make sure they weren't taking anything off the food as they were going in. Any of you all realize, put something in your mouth and try to whistle, it doesn't work. Behind that you'd have, I just put this one block as a building. It could be a sawmill, it could be a brickyard, it could be a barn, anything like that. Your next thing you'd have would be a smokehouse because you didn't have means of preserving your food, so you'd generally smoke your foods. Following that, you'd have a series of slave quarters, and then you'd have your areas of cultivation. So with this brief animation, you can see the structure of a plantation. So looking at the earlier pictures, you see that each sliver that went back was a plantation that was basically following this format. Now, if you'll notice, the streets of New Orleans follow this, so to speak, fan shape. The reason was because the property was sold on so many arpents along the riverfront, and then they went back. And as the plantations were developed into roads, they linked these plantations together, and that's what gives the fan shape to the streets, because the boundaries of the two plantations would often be the streets that ran perpendicular to the river. If I'm not mistaken, the 40 arpent line is actually Claiborne Avenue. This is what a plantation house would look like. The upper part of the plantation house is often arranged called the widow's loft because it will give you the opportunity to view upriver to see if any river boats or anything were coming down. If they were, you'd want to get your crops up to the batcher and on your landing so that you could get them to market. This was the bell tower. Sometimes it was a tower like this one at Homus. A lot of times it was just a simple bell. The slaves were required by the bell was their time. In the morning it was rung to wake them up to get them to the fields. In the afternoon it was rung to give them a break. It was rung again to tell them to go back to work. in the evening to come home back to work, from work, and go back to their homes. This is a cistern, for those of you all who don't know what a cistern is. This was also one of the major causes of malaria and yellow fever at the time, because they didn't realize that the standing fresh water provided the mosquito, which was a vector of yellow fever, an opportunity to flourish and grow in the warmer seasons. This one's difficult to make out, but this is, it's got a Civil War museum on the front of it. That's from Homer's house, but that was the kitchen. So you can see how well developed it was and detached. I think we know what that is. You know, inside the homes themselves, some of them actually later on would have shower facilities and some semblance of indoor plumbing. A lot of times they would have chamber pots, but for the people on the outside in the fields, when they didn't use the fields directly, they would use an outhouse. This is a slave quarter. As you can see, it's a rather primitive view in that it's based on the ground, so you have the mud floor, no windows, and very small. Other plantations, though, would have a little bit more involved. If you look at this one here, the picture's kind of crude, but if you look at the arrangement of the homes, the size of the homes with fireplaces and everything, this is a rather extensive complex for slave quarters behind a plantation. Obviously a very wealthy plantation. This is the sugar production. Sugar production is what was known down here in St. Bernard Parish. Few people realize they have a tendency to give credit to Etienne de Boré for inventing sugar production and sugar refining. His plantation was at the site of the present Audubon Park. But actually it was Manuel Solis down here in St. Bernard Parish who first refined sugar with a slave by the name of Morin. And I believe Etienne de Boré, if I have the story correct, got Morin from Solis and started the production. And his very first year, he made $12,000 in sugar production when they were proved that you could actually granulate sugar. Prior to that, they had basically molasses and a thing called tafia, which was like a form of rum. This shows the whole sequence where you see you have the main house, you have the slave quarters, you have the sugar being grown. Here you have the fields being cultivated. You have a gentleman, his slave, sitting down cutting the sugar to cane. Here it's brought in on baskets and brought into the grinder where it's be grinded, and across the whole top you have kind of a scenario of the different sugar mills, the plantations in the background, and the river boats that are coming up. This is sugarcane. Sugarcane is just grass. That's really all it is. And the key to sugarcane was getting it out the ground before the first freeze. Even to this day, if you've been down the area and down in La Fouche, where there's a lot of sugarcane production going on, the longer you keep it in the ground, the higher the sugar content. But if you have a freeze come in, you lose the crop. So it was always a very difficult business because you had to keep it in the ground long enough to get the sugar content up, but get it out before the first freeze came in, and then you had to hope that you didn't have too much sugar on the market because you could play all your cards right, but if everybody else played their cards right, the price would drop because there was too much product on the market. It was a very, very difficult process. This is a close-up of sugarcane. This is loading sugar. Now we use much better facilities, but this is the old way of doing it with ox-drawn carts. Now, following Plantations around the Battle of New Orleans, Mr. Hyland is going to do a more involved presentation on the plantations that are more noted with St. Bernard Parish. But at the time of the Battle of New Orleans, you have to look at the situation as a series of plantations, beginning with the McCarty House, which was Andrew Jackson's headquarters. And from there, it went down to this was a sketch that was from Lossing's book, which was printed in 1860s. And this sketch is of the Rodrigue House, so you can see that it was in pretty bad condition in the 1860s. That was the canal that Jackson had used as his main line of defense. This is a view from the river towards Delaronde. I'm sure William can say a lot more about that, but it was one of the more beautiful homes, in the area. He also, if I'm not mistaken, had 7 daughters, so that obviously the wedding presents must have cost him a small fortune. This is the Delaronde home, at the turn of the century. What probably remains now, I would imagine, are a few of the bricks on the corners, but you can see how beautiful that home was at one time. And at this stage here, at the turn of the centuries, it's basically being used as a barn. What a treasure to have lost. This was the Lacoste mansion. As you can see, it's elevated for reasons that the river would often overflow its banks. It was also used as a headquarters during the Battle of New Orleans, and also as a repair depot for some of the cannon. And this is the Villeray plantation, which was a little bit further down. This is actually at the point where the British came in during the Battle of New Orleans. So the Battle of New Orleans was fought along the sugar plantations that made up St. Bernard Parish. This is a photograph of the Villeray plantation, and if you notice, this addition here was placed on, but this was the original plantation home. So, many of these plantations would become victims of age. They would be torn down. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the Vaudreuil plantation was replaced by, I'm forgetting, old. But anyway, a number of the plantations will be torn, LeBeau, a number of plantations will either be burned or they'll be torn down and newer buildings taken in their place. And so at this point, I would like to turn the lecture over to Mr. Hyland so that he can give us a more in-depth presentation of the plantations we have presently, in St. Bernard. Thank you.
Well, let's see now. Nice blinding light, isn't that wonderful? Ron, thank you so much, and it's such a pleasure to be here tonight and to address all of you once again. Originally, it had been my understanding that I was going to share the program with Alberta Lewis, and of course it's wonderful to have Ron here, such an authority, such a gentleman. He's dedicated so much of his time to the history of our parish, and his work is very commendable. So it's wonderful that he's joined us, but originally I had planned just to do my own little overview of the plantations, and then let Mrs. Lewis talk about the landmark in which she lives, Sevastopol Plantation. But anyway, so we're going to now see what we can do with my presentation, which will somewhat overlap Ron's. And the first image we'll see is an image of the map that, a larger image that Ron had shown you earlier. And this map actually dates to about 1724 or 23. And we don't know who did the map, but this is the earliest map of what became St. Bernard Parish. And it shows some of the original grant holders. Let's see if I can use this crazy thing. It shows some of the original grants in St. Bernard, and just about there is the plantation of Henri Leblanc de la Croix. And he had this grant given to him by the Company of the Indies in 1721. And one of the reasons that I say that this map dates probably to 1724 is that there's several names of grant holders on this map that we know were not here before 1724, so 23 may be a little bit early. This area here is what we call Pointe Saint-Antoine, and it was the original name for what we call now Chalmette. And it was named for Antoine de Chateauguay, who was the younger brother of Iberville and Bienville. And it's very interesting to note that the configuration, for instance, let's see if I can get this thing here. The configuration of Algiers Point, which is right here, is actually correct for the 1720s. The river has changed its course so dramatically that it's virtually unrecognizable from our 2005 maps to this 1720s map. Just across from the Orleans, which is right here, was the old plantation of Adrien Dupourget, and there'd been some supposition that Adrien Dupourget had actually made this map, but again, we'll never know. The original of this map is in the Newbury collection, and the map comes in sections, and it's kept joined together. The houses are all delineated in red, and it's a very colorful map, and it's been in the Newbury collection since the turn of the 20th century. And I tried to find out from whom they had acquired the map, when I was up there, and they weren't able to give me the provenance, and I would have loved to have known that. You'll also notice back here, Bayou St. John, and Bayou St. John, of course, was settled before the city of New Orleans. It actually dates to about 1709. Those were some of the first concessions there. It's also interesting to note that this line here is the 40 arpent line. And there was a system of arpents which the French had devised and brought with them from France. An arpent, or an arpent, is 192 French feet, but about 196, 95, or 97 English feet. You know, the French have always distinguished themselves from us in many ways, and this is still another way. And the arpent is a unit of measure which is roughly equivalent to an acre. And then Ron mentioned the depth of the profondeur de 40 arpents, the depth of 40 arpents. Those were the original grants that were given. In the 1750s, there became such a demand in the French colonies, in the French islands, for our lumber, because the supplies of their lumber were exhausted by the 18th century, that there was awarded by the French government the droit de double concession, the right of double concession. So that meant that property owners wanting to annex an additional 40 arpents behind their properties were able to do so. And all of these plantations had mill races and sawmills, almost all of them. Now, in the 1720s, right here at what became Chalmette, we had the first cultivation of indigo. And indigo, or indigo, was the first major cash crop in Louisiana. The first indigo was brought to Louisiana from Saint-Domingue, which we call today Haiti. And it was planted by Bienville on the west bank, and you see there Bienville's tract. And then it was planted by Marais, Dupuis, and Marais de la Tour at what became the Chalmette battlefield, again in 1723. Now, the process of refining indigo was particularly vile. It seems, according to Bossu and several other French who came and described the process here in Louisiana, that there were sheds, open-aired, open-sided sheds built, and that pots were set in succession, and that in these pots, the indigo plants were allowed to rot. And it was the rotten residue from the bottom of the pots which was ultimately extracted and used to make blue dye. But the mortality rate amongst the slaves was horrendous, and just the descriptions of the stench the descriptions are horrible. And then even the overseers who worked these indigo plantations usually had greatly shortened lives. So in any event, also I should mention here, you see, Détour des Anglais. Détour des Anglais is the site of English Turn. And if you will notice, in 1723, it's actually indicated around Poydras from Violet all the way around to about Carnarvon. So that is actually the Détour des Anglais, the actual entrance to English Turn, if you're coming from downriver, is still in Plaquemine Parish. But the actual, where we believe probably where the actual happening, where the English actually were turned by Bienville's trick, probably happened right there where Bayou Terrebonne entered the Mississippi River. And of course, as you see in 1723, there were no land grants really below Mero. And it wasn't until later that the system of levees was perfected to such an extent that people were able to settle down there. And then furthermore, because Bayou Terrebonne 4,000 years ago had been the main channel, well, 3,500 years ago, had been the main channel of the Mississippi River, even though the river had diverted its main channel and built the Plaquemine Delta in times of flood, the river would flood tremendously through that whole corridor from Violet well down into Plaquemine. So that's why that area wasn't granted. But anyway, it's very interesting. Let's go to the next image. Now this, and Ron also showed this map, this is the Zimpel map of 1836. It was done by Charles Zimpel. Zimpel Street in New Orleans is named for him, and the original of this map is in the collection of the Historic New Orleans collection in New Orleans. And you see up here a racetrack. Believe it or not, that racetrack was called the Faubourg La Course, and that suburb was the site of what became St. Maurice Church and the area which evolved around St. Maurice. And that was owned by the Pandalay family, and they were very, very prominent, very much involved in business in New Orleans and in the region. Just below that, we're just going down a little bit, you see the United States Barracks right here. And then this is actually Fisherman's Canal. And that was the upper boundary of St. Bernard Parish from 1817 until the slaughterhouse and the advent of the slaughterhouse, which meant that the slaughterhouse was still in Orleans Parish, and the necessity of moving that boundary from Fisherman's Canal to Jackson Barracks. So, of course, this also means that in 1815, when the Battle of New Orleans was fought, the Chalmette battlefield was in the parish of Orleans. And then as we move down, you see, well, this is Benoit Tremé. And actually, let's go back up to right here. This is Alexandre Lesseps and John Linton right there. That was the upper boundary of the Bienvenue plantation. And then the lower boundary of it was just about there. Well, actually just about here. And that boundary, that was the old plantation that had belonged at one time to Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil, who was governor of Louisiana, and who, after the governorship in Louisiana, became the governor of Nouvelle-France. And I believe he was one of those who had the unfortunate duty for the French of surrendering Nouvelle-France to the British after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. But in any event, he had an indigo plantation in what became Araby, and then later he sold that plantation to Antoine Bienvenu. That was about 1750. And that plantation remained, it was 1749, and that plantation remained in possession of the Bienvenu family until the death of Antoine Bienvenu, who was the progenitor of the family in Louisiana. You see, we have one of his descendants on your advisory board here. And then his widow died in 1800, and then the children subdivided the tract and they sold it. And as nearly as we could tell, Benoit Tremé bought ultimately the site of the old Bienvenue plantation. Now, Benoit Tremé was one of the sons of Claude Tremé, who subdivided the plantation just next to New Orleans on Bayou Road, which became Faubourg Tremé, or the Tremé suburb. And then his sons, Numa and Adolphe Tremé, and the Reese family here in St. Bernard descends from them, they sold the property at auction to François Barthélemy Lebeau in 1854, and that's how the Lebeau family became involved. As we move down, the widow Dacontel, this plantation became a part of the American Sugar Refinery along with the Ferret Brothers property, those two tracts. And the Dacontel tract, there was a huge brickyard there, and the house which Paul Dacontel, or the widow Paul Dacontel, built is still standing. It was for many years the office of the American Sugar Refinery, and we'll see it later. The Ferret Brothers tract was eventually sold to Frédéric Roy, who was the progenitor of the Roy family here in Louisiana. He'd been born near Bordeaux in southwest France, and he became very famous in 19th century New Orleans as a builder, a contractor. And one of the homes he built is the old Le Pret house, the three-story house at the corner of Orleans and Dauphine Streets in the French Quarter. And then, of course, raw bricks, for instance, were used in the construction of St. Maurice Church. And today, ever so often, when old buildings are being demolished, you'll still run across bricks with the stamp Roy in it. And those all came from his brickyard. Not only was he a businessman, Frederick Roy, he also was a member of the police jury and was very, very much interested in the civic life of St. Bernard, and a very honorable person of great integrity and great believer in education. He was highly educated. And of course, he saw to it that his sons, Sebastien Roy and William Frederick Roy, who founded the St. Bernard Voice, were both well educated and highly cultivated people. As we come down, this is the actual battlefield right here. And the battlefield was ultimately acquired by Hilaire, I think it was, and Michel Saint-Amand. Now, these Saint-Amands were free people of color, and they purchased the property from the estate of the Chalmette family. And, you know, many horrible things happened in St. Bernard Parish as a result of the Battle of New Orleans. And many things happened that even set families asunder. And of course, it's not a well-known fact here in St. Bernard, but Pierre Denis de la Ronde and Ignace Martin de Lino Chalmette were half-brothers. They both served in the Spanish militia. They both fought under Galvez in the Galvez expedition. They were both Spanish officers. Chalmette distinguished himself in service as commandant of the Arkansas post. And after many years of living in such desolation, he couldn't wait to return to Louisiana. He came in the 1790s, bought property here in St. Bernard, and then ultimately became a sugar planter. In the family, he was called Le Gros, the fat one, because he liked to eat a great deal. And he also had a wonderful wine cellar. And he partook very liberally of very fine wines whenever he could. And that was quite often. But he was very benevolent, a very good man, wonderful family person. But he tended at times, perhaps, to live beyond his means. So his brother, Pierre Denis de la Ronde, who was very conscious of money, would loan him money very often to get him through until his cane crops would come in. And he had done so in 1814. So regretfully, of course, not only was Chalmette plundered and his whole home destroyed, but Denis de la Ronde had also suffered staggering losses as a result of the British invasion, and he felt compelled to foreclose on Chalmette. So he did. And then, of course, according to the family, Chalmette died of apoplexy not long after. And the house, the property was sold, and that's how it came into possession of the Saint-Amand brothers. And they were the ones who subdivided the plantation. And they ultimately also bought the upper part of the Bienvenue plantation. And together, those properties came to be known as the Battleground plantation. So any of you who have done title research will know these names and recognize these names. Just below Antoine Bienvenu, who was actually the grandson of the original Antoine Bienvenu, is Versailles. And this indeed had been the plantation of Pierre Denis de la Ronde. We have maps of this tract of land dating to the 1760s. And the house itself is quite an enigma, and much has been said about it. Actually, this is the original layout of Versailles, and about 1839, the plan was changed, and there was a grid of streets designed, and Joseph Pillier actually did the plan, and he projected streets from New Orleans all the way down into Versailles subdivision. So that's why today, and it was, of course, Pillier working for Daniel Warburg, who was a German Jew, who subdivided the place. It was Warburg who did it, and it was Warburg who named the development Versailles, not Denis de la Ronde. Denis de la Ronde was happy to just call the place his place. It didn't have to have a name. It belonged to him. That was sufficient for him. And in any event, that's why today in Versailles subdivision, you have some of the names of Casa Calvo, Morales, Great Man Street. Those were all names of streets which were extensions of streets that had been opened by Bernard Marigny in the Faubourg Marigny in 1806. And then later he gave names of his own, Warburg, to the streets, such as Montesquieu and different other people who were very famous as scientists or philosophers in French history. Now this goes all the way down, actually below Lacoste, which is where the Chalmette Library is, goes all the way down to the old Jumonville plantation, which is in Merrill today. It's very interesting also, you could see that by 1836, the levee had changed its configuration, because about 1815, here's your Pointe Saint-Antoine, and in 1815, the levee actually went this way. And since the 1836 map, the Bachelor has built out another half mile into the river, and as much land as has been built on the east bank, the Bachelor Bank, that's how much land has been lost on the west bank, which the French call the écart, or the cliff bank. So let's go to the next image. Now, this is the other area which is important in understanding the history of Saint Bernard, and I was just pointing to Bayou Terre-aux-Bœufs. Terre-aux-Bœufs is a French name, and it literally means land of the cattle or land of the oxen, and it's perhaps more correctly translated the cattle range. And it's so named because when Iberville first explored the area in 1699, according to Pennicot, his ship's carpenter, who kept a wonderful journal, he said that he found in this area bison. So that's the origin of La Terre-aux-Bœufs. And then you can see the pattern of land grants. This is a 1792 map, or at least a copy of a 1792 map, done in the 1830s, which our clerk of court was so gracious to place at my disposal and allow me to copy many years ago. And as you can see, it was just one Isleño family after another sent into possession. Now, Lorenzo Wiltz, or Laurent Wiltz, the Wiltz family was a family originally from the German coast, and they became Gallicized and then for a time Hispanized. He was an officer in the Spanish militia, and he actually purchased, right here, some 5 land grants, which had been awarded to Isleño families along the bayou, and he assembled these grants into one estate, and he became a sugar planter. And it was just about this time that there was great interest, 1792, in the planting of sugar. One of the cities that we have a sister city relationship with in Gran Canaria is named Ingenio. Ingenio is Spanish for sugar mill. And according to Pierre Clément Lossa, in his papers, he records that Manuel Solis had come to St. Bernard with the Canarios from Cuba, and that many of these Canarios were from Gran Canaria, and we know that the vast majority of Canarians who came to St. Bernard from Gran Canaria came from the Ingenio area. And he said that while they were stranded in Cuba during the war between Spain and Great Britain, because Spain had signed the Pacte de Famille with France, the Isleños from Gran Canaria, who were lovers of rum, gathered sugarcane plants. And when they came to Louisiana, they brought the plants and planted them in St. Bernard. And that the first idea that Manuel Solis had was to have a rum distillery, and he did. And tafia was the word that was used here in Louisiana and also in Saint-Domingue for the rum. And it was considered a rather crude drink, but it was something consumed by everyone, be you a slave or a freed person of color, whatever. I remember one time years ago, you'll forgive my digression. You know, I do digress sometimes. I remember one time years ago going through some papers of my family, and I read that my ancestor, Antoine Marigny, had just come back from the Bastille because, of course, he had opposed one of the French governors and denounced him as someone dreadful. So he had been imprisoned along with other notable people in the Bastille for a couple of years. While he had been gone, his poor wife had been forced to borrow money from New Orleans merchants. Well, when he came back, he found out that these merchants had been in league with those who were leading or trying to organize the insurrection against the Spaniards. And of course, when the insurrection failed, he told his wife not to pay the bill, the note. And so she said, well, you know, they've been really adamant, and then they sued Antoine Marigny. Well, Marigny, according to the people who brought suit against him, they said that he had, as usual, been drinking tafia, and that very angrily he had battered down the door and threatened them with exposing them to the Spaniards, which he ultimately did. So as a result, my ancestor never had to pay the loan, and they were sent to El Morro in Havana. So you see, turnabout sometimes is fair play. But anyway, getting back to the rum had been the real reason for the establishment of these sugar cane plantations, originally by Canary Islanders, so it would appear. And then it was in the 1790s that Antonio Méndez, who was a Cuban, who was an official in the Spanish Cabildo, joined with Solis to try to granulate sugar, and they did, but they could not succeed in granulating sugar which would stay granulated. They ran out of money, and that's how Boré became the person to be involved with Antoine Morin and to purchase the different slaves and different people who had knowledge of all this. But it is interesting to note, though, that prior to the 1780s, the Jesuits had experimented with sugarcane cultivation, and it had failed. There had been an attempt by a French colonist, Villard-Dubreuil, to granulate sugar in 1757, and he did, but then it reverted to syrup. And then Etienne Boré's father, Louis Boré, in the 1760s also granulated sugar. But ultimately that enterprise failed, and because he became involved again in the insurrection against the Spaniards, his land was confiscated. So it's an interesting and convoluted story about sugar. By the way, this is Michel Fichet. He actually was Michael Fisher. He was an expatriate from the American colonies who decided to establish here in St. Bernard, and that's the upper boundary of what became Delacroix Island. That grant was purchased by Daniel Clark, and then in turn, Francois Duccio Delacroix, in his capacity as executor of Clark's estate, acquired that tract of land, and that's why today it's Ile Delacroix, Delacroix Island. But even in the 1790s, that tract of land is called in Spanish records La Isla, the island. So let's go to the next image. Now we'll begin to look at some of the images of St. Bernard at different times. Now this is an image of the Crescent City Livestock Landing and Slaughterhouse Company. It actually began in the late 1860s, and half of the property was in Orleans Parish, but the actual plant was in Orleans Parish, I'm sorry, at the time, but the other part of the property, which was undeveloped, was in St. Bernard. And of course, there had been an ordinance promulgated by the New Orleans City Council, or the Board of Aldermen, in the 1860s, which prohibited the operation of slaughterhouses within the corporate limits of the city of New Orleans. So that's why in 1874 the boundary was moved from Fisherman's Canal to, as I mentioned earlier, Jackson Barracks. This building, Marion Roy Ducrot told me, is the St. Bernard Voice. And she told me she remembered this building being moved from the levee front when it was set back in 1912, and that it was moved on logs and with, I believe, drayage animals. And if you look at it, you could see how it easily could be the Voice building, because all of this is rather skewed. The St. Bernard Bank was over, trying to think, probably in this area. Or maybe, no, that was up in here. You see, some of this was demolished later on. This is the old slaughterhouse that most of us can remember, which stood until the 1990s, when a tornado, a waterspout formed on the river, and it touched down and it destroyed what was left of the building, which had burned. Interestingly enough, this is an image of the LeBeau House when this was done, and this was done about, probably 1890, 1900 at the latest, this lithograph. Let's go to the next image. This, of course, is the LeBeau House, and this is how it appeared in 1912. You see the fence that ran across the front of it. By this time, it had become the Friscoville Hotel, and it was very much frequented by many very prominent people. And you see here some of the outbuildings from the old LeBeau House, and these are actually slave quarter buildings, which again, Marion Roy Ducrot told me, had been moved from that location, and they're still to be found, though greatly remodeled, on Friscoville Avenue. Let's go to the next image. And of course, here you see how the agrarian St. Bernard was gradually being replaced by industry. You know, in the early 20th century, there was the expression coined that St. Bernard was the industrial frontier of the great Gulf South. And this had been one of the great ambitions of the people in control of St. Bernard politically in those days. They wanted St. Bernard to have a flourishing port, they wanted it to have industry, and they also wanted it to have agriculture. They wanted a mix of all of these uses. And the Roys, the Ducrots, other people were very much involved in the formulation of all these policies. And it was the Stoppenalls, of course, the Nunezes, they were very successful in bringing a great deal of needed change and improvement to St. Bernard. You know, for instance, I didn't mention to you, it was the slaughterhouse that brought electricity and gas to what ultimately became Araby. Now, when the sugar refinery was completed about 1912 or so, or just shortly before then, it was the largest sugar refinery in the world. Let's go on, Jerry. And here you see other images of the refinery shortly after the construction had been completed. And Gene Cizik and many of my architectural historian friends are very fond of saying that the building, the refinery building itself, is an excellent example of commercial, industrial, early 20th century architecture, and they feel that it could easily be landmarked. However, I know of an American sugar refinery wouldn't want us to do that. Let's go to the next image. Now, this is an image of Kenilworth, and you see the dormer that had been added by 1912. I'm going to show you later on an earlier image of Kenilworth, and you'll see it without it. And you see all the orange orchards. You know, citrus had been cultivated in Louisiana since the early 18th century. The Jesuits, again, had introduced the citrus cultivation to this area. And then, of course, it's rather interesting to note, all roads in the New World, in part, seem to lead back historically to the Canary Islands, because the cultivation of citrus was introduced to the Spanish Empire in the New World through the Canary Islands. And it's still something to behold in the islands today. Let's go to the next one. This is an image of the old St. Bernard Courthouse. Now, this was the second courthouse on the site. This was the one built by Harmon Turner, and it was built in the 1880s. Mrs. Torres has the plans of the courthouse in her files and her archives. And here you see, this is Lovinsky Nunez, who was president of the police jury, and there are other members of the police jury at the time. Sheriff of Stoppenall is somewhere around in there. Raoul Ducrot is right there. He was the assessor. Sebastian Roy is right there. It's interesting when you get to see the image a little bit closer. And then this courthouse stood until the 1920s. And because actually they built the new courthouse, which is today, or was until recently, Beauregard Middle School, in proximity to it, but they didn't demolish it at first. Because after St. Bernard Church burned in 1916, for a while the church held its services in the abandoned courthouse. So let's go to the next image. Now this is an image of Kenilworth in 1900. And here you see the roof. It's a cypress shake roof without the dormers. And here you see the Estopanol family. I believe that's Albert Estopanol Jr., who became sheriff of St. Bernard later. And then that's the father, Albert Estopanol, who by this time was, I believe, elected to Congress. If not, he was finishing his term as lieutenant governor of Louisiana. And you could see what a fine home it was. This house was built by Jean Chauveau, who had come to St. Bernard in Louisiana from Saint-Domingue, fleeing the revolt there in Haiti. And it was built between 1816 and 1819. And one of the interesting features of the house are these truncated columns. And that's rather typical of the French West Indies. As a matter of fact, everything about the house is very typical of the Indies. Next image. Now this is Three Oaks Plantation, and this had been built by Sylvain Peroux. And it's interesting that the house had columns around it like that. But the plan of the house was 6 rooms, one opening into the other. So it was a traditional Creole plan. And it stood until the mid-1960s when the house was demolished. Let's go to the next image. This is the Cavaroc House as it looked after it had first been rehabilitated for use as the office of the American Sugar Refinery. And it's interesting to look at the plaster and see how in those days it was all scored to look like stone. Next image. This was the plantation of Lorenzo Wilts. You saw the map of his plantation a little bit earlier in 1792. This was his home. Ultimately, Felix Marrero, who was the founder of the Marrero family in St. Bernard, purchased the house, and it became a second plantation, and he would divide his time between this place and a place which stood until the 1980s in Verret Village here in St. Bernard. Let's go to the next image. This is the Turner House. And you see it's a one-story house with a center hall, and it has a widow's walk on the roof. But many people had said that this was the summer home of Galvez, but frankly, I've never been able to document that. And looking at the house, it's definitely one from the 19th century, but it was just perpendicular from Ducrot Museum in St. Bernard Village. Let's go to the next image. This is the Maison à Jalousie, which was the old Roy plantation. And according to some accounts, this was the American hospital during the Battle of New Orleans. This home stood where today, I understand, stands the main plant of the American Sugar Refinery. And here you see some of the Roys. They were typical Creoles. They loved to be outside and to live outside whenever they could. And then there were many houses in Louisiana with the jalousie treatment, and you see how it goes all around the house. But today, there are very few, if any, left. There's one in the St. Francisville area. There are a couple, but not very many. Let's go on. This is the old Armstrong House, and it's still standing today. This is the house next to Ducrot Museum as you're going upriver. And this had been the home of Octave Sébastien Rousseau, and so it was, for a time, the old St. Bernard Courthouse, because he was the parish judge, and prior to the establishment of a permanent courthouse, wherever the parish judge lived is where the courthouse was. So today, the house is one of the oldest in the parish. Let's go to the next image. I think we're going back. Let's see. This is another image of LeBeau House, and it's interesting to look at the fence that you see in front of the house, and also the vestiges of the beautiful gardens that had once been around the place, and the stairs coming down. You know, it's important to look at a house like Kenilworth, a house like the Armstrong house, the old Rousseau home, some other vernacular homes I'm going to show you. And these were all homes which were principal homes on smaller working sugar plantations. And you know, we always think of a plantation as being a grand home like the LeBeau house or the image of Three Oaks. But actually, most of the plantations were much smaller, like Sevastopol. They were what were called in French the maison de maître, and it was the most common, prevalent type of home found along the river corridor and Bayou-Lafourche corridor in the southern part of the state. And of course, you know, really, the plantation in Louisiana is the English translation of habitation. An habitation is a farm. An habitant in the Old French is not only an inhabitant, but it's also a farmer. So when you get down to it, these plantations were just larger farms in many instances, and not always, which grew cash crops, which produced a great deal of money. Let's go on to the next. This is the old Chateau des Fleurs, and there may be some people in the room who will remember it. This was the home built by David Urquhart, and later purchased by Alexandre de Lesseps, the great-great-grandfather of de Lesseps Morrison. And then the de Lesseps family had it and sold it to Joseph Marrow's grandfather, Joseph Momus. And this house became one of the very first Spring Fiesta homes. As a matter of fact, it was part of the very first Spring Fiesta in the late 1930s. It burned in either 1938 or 39, and the ruins stood for many years. But again, a beautiful home, Jerry. This is the old home that is identified as the St. Alexander House, belonged to James St. Alexandre, who for almost 50 years was clerk of court in St. Bernard Parish. But the house had belonged to Charles Fagot, who was a Spanish officer and the very first parish judge of St. Bernard. And the house is still standing today. It's directly opposite the Isleño Museum, on the other side of Bayou Terrebonne. But you see a very fine home. And again, this is very typical of the plantation home, if you will, which was most numerous in Louisiana in the 18th and 19th centuries. And it's regretful that this example has been largely destroyed in the state, and that's why it's so important that Sevastopol is being so well preserved and being so well used. Jerry, let's see if we have any. This is an image of the outbuildings at the Poydras plantation. You see slave dwellings, outhouses. This was a Gothic revival barn, the sugar mill here. So you see these plantations were literal villages, communities unto themselves, self-contained, self-supporting. And let's go to the next image. And this is the actual Poydras plantation, and the side of the house is on the property at Poydras, right there near the levee. And as a matter of fact, this is the cistern, and you can still see the base of that cistern in the yard of the house that had belonged to the Ducrot family, which Sidney Torres purchased and is doing a wonderful job of maintaining. And you could see, Gene Cizik many times has talked about this house, and he believes that it was probably a Creole house with just gabled roofs, and that sometime about 1850, these dormers and the turret and gables were added to the house in the Italianate style.
Let's give Mr. Hyland a hand. That's fantastic. We're going to have a little bit of time and be ready for questions.
Very good.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that was fantastic. All right, I'd like to thank everybody for coming. What we'll do is we will have a quick break here in just a second. Before we do that, though, I would like to thank somebody else who's very integral to the success of the History Lecture Series, and that's Dave Destins in the control booth, who does all the production for the TV shows and DVDs. So let's give him a because, of course, you can see all the lectures. We have the DVDs that I distribute to all the local libraries, and they also show on both local television channels, so we appreciate that. I'd like to thank everybody for coming. This is the end of another great season. We can look forward to seeing the reruns on TV all summer, as well as looking forward to next September when we start our 5th year. So thanks for coming.